Hello, it's midday. This is a Sky News Cost of Living special programme, an hour of insight into the state of the UK economy and the extraordinary political events that are shaping it. Well, on hand are our panel of experts to give their analysis. We're joined by our city editor, Mark Kleinman, our business presenter, Ian King. Also with us, our deputy political editor, Sam Coates, and our economics and data editor, Ed Conway. And coming up today, the Chancellor meets Britain's biggest lenders as mortgage costs spiral. Leading economists warn that stealth taxes will outweigh any benefits for people from the mini-budget. Oil prices rocket as the UK prepares to set out a plan to keep the lights on this winter. And an embattled Prime Minister heads to Europe after a bruising week at home. Good afternoon. We start this Sky News Cost of Living special programme with mortgages. And the Chancellor has been meeting the UK's leading banks and building societies this morning after his economic plans sparked turmoil in the mortgage sector. On the day of Kwasi Kwarteng's so-called mini-budget, September the 23rd, the average mortgage interest rate was 4.7%. Since then, the two-year fixed mortgage rate has increased, climbing to 5.75% on Monday. And by yesterday, the average rate for a two-year fixed mortgage hit 6.07% for the first time since the 2008 financial crash. Well, let's bring in our city editor, Mark Kleinman, who broke the story about this meeting that wasn't necessarily publicly known before we told the world about it yesterday. What do you think that the Chancellor, what kind of reception do you think he's going to get from the bankers?
Well, the meeting was due to wrap up around about now, Jane, and the clear agenda from the banking industry is to communicate to Kwasi Kwarteng, the Chancellor, that there are real problems in Britain's mortgage market and they are not the fault of the financiers. What we saw after that mini-budget, of course, was real instability in financial markets, and that has led to difficulties for banks in pricing those home loans to consumers, which has in turn meant that hundreds of mortgage deals over the last couple of weeks have been withdrawn or frozen. Now, a couple of the key issues that the banks wanted to talk to the Chancellor about today were a request to extend something called the Mortgage Guarantee Scheme, which was put in place by the government last year and underwrite some of the losses on loans, home loans to first-time buyers. The other issue, though, is a bit more nuanced in the sense that it relates to a piece of regulation that's being brought in by the city watchdog, the Financial Conduct Authority, which is called the Consumer Duty. And what banks are worried about is that if they are extending home loans with mortgage rates, as you pointed out, spiking so sharply to rates we haven't seen, to levels we haven't seen for 15 years or so, are these banks going to be held liable under this new FCA rule for issuing mortgages to consumers who can't afford to repay them? So lots of tension, almost certainly during this meeting in the last hour or so. We'll get a readout, a summary, no doubt, of what has been discussed over the next couple of hours. But clearly there are real issues from the banking industry side in just how the mortgage market in Britain is going to be restored to something like normality.
So the Chancellor, wants to know why they're putting up mortgage rates so much. What he'll also be wanting to know, presumably, if any of these higher rates are going to be passed on to people with savings as well, because they don't seem to have risen in the same rate.
Well, there's been this perennial mismatch that we've talked about many times between the loans, the interest rates that are charged to consumers on loans like mortgages and those that are paid to ordinary savers. That's something that no doubt will have been pressed upon the banks by the Treasury during these talks this morning. And there are a number of other issues, including the fact that Kwasi Kwarteng is due to unveil a big package of city reforms later on this month. Whether that is still going to go ahead as a result of the turmoil that we saw in financial markets last week remains open to question.
So interest rates going up for mortgages, fewer mortgages out there on the market. We can understand that, Ed. But the mortgage burden is also going up. Can you just explain what that means?
Yeah, it's worth remembering that obviously we talk a lot about kind of official interest rates, but there's a difference between that and what
we all end up paying on our mortgages or indeed on savings accounts, as you're saying. Let me just kind of go through some of that, because it's been, there's been some enormous changes really just over the course of the last few weeks. And what we can do is just kind of show you some of those changes. Look at this first of all. This is the Bank of England base rate. Well, they actually call it bank rate these days. And this is what's happened to it up until kind of where we are now. So that's kind of where we are at the moment, 2.25%. My mic's not on.
It's a small technical thing, but it'd be such a pity while you're showing us your graphs.
There we are.
To hear you as well.
Okay,
right.
Now I hope you can hear me now. Okay, because this is really genuinely quite important. What's going on here is this is the Bank of England's official rate, and that's where we are at the moment, 2.25%, so 2.25%. And what I'm going to show you here is kind of where markets and traders, people within the market, expected it to go in the coming years. So this is where the expectation was back in February. So, I mean, it's kind of extraordinary, isn't it, to think about how much things have changed since then. Back then, people who were making bets on this stuff only thought that it was going to go up to 1.75%. And inflation was already starting to kind of rear its head at that point. But look at what's happened since then. So what we're looking into the future here. Over the future, what people think is going to happen to interest rates. That was in February. Then it went up to about 2.75 in August. Remember, this is just expectations, but this feeds in to the mortgage costs that we're all paying, because it goes into something called swaps rates. You're talking about the kind of costs that mortgage lenders look at when they're working out how to price their mortgages. And then, by early September, obviously we had the new Liz Truss government by that point. No one was 100% sure what they were going to do, clearly, as it turned out. But by then, already, the cost of borrowing, in terms of the expectations for where it was going, was up to 4.75% for bank rate next year. So you can see this getting higher and higher and higher, the cost of borrowing going higher, even before the mini-budget. But look at what happened next. So then came the mini-budget, and then last week, that went up to a peak of 6.1%. And I'll show you in a second why that matters so much. The good news is, since then, it has come down a fair bit. Well, I say a fair bit. It's in between the two at the moment. It's about 5.5% is where markets currently expect those rates to go, and that could obviously yo-yo around. But the big difference is really the comparison with where we were only at the start of the year and where we are now. That's a big difference. And when you look and basically look at what's available in the market, you see that that stuff's actually already starting to feed through. So what this is just showing you is, a moment ago, Jayne was talking about the kind of average rate that's available on a 2-year fixed rate mortgage. Well, this is basically it, going all the way back to 2008. And you can see, look, around 2007, 2008, it was up at around 6-7%. So really high in comparison with where it was subsequently. Look, the era of cheap money, cheap mortgages in comparison with much of history. But look at what's happened recently. It was climbing up before this mini-budget, before Liz Truss was elected. It was getting up to around that kind of 4% mark. But look what happened subsequently. Look at that line. Now up to 6.07%. It's actually climbed a little bit potentially since then. And that is the highest that we've seen since 2008. And here's why that's significant. As Jayne was saying a second ago, it's not just about this rate, it's also about other factors. It's about how much debt you have, it's about how high your income is in comparison with your mortgage repayments, and that shows your ability to repay it. That's the important thing. So the chart we really need to look at is not that, it's an affordability chart, and I've got one here, as it so happens, which shows you the mortgage burden. And the higher this line is, basically, the more of your income you're paying on your mortgage each month. This is for new deals, OK? And a couple of things to note here, OK? That was just before the last financial crisis, really getting pretty high there. That was the period in the late 80s, early 90s, before we had an enormous housing crash, negative equity. It was really a really terrible time, probably the most torrid housing crisis we've had in this country. But look here, it was really low recently. You know, we've been living through quite a kind of fortunate time in terms of mortgage payments. But look at what happened subsequently. So before the mini-budget, these rates, in terms of the available rates out there and how much they dig into your income, that had risen to the highest level since 2008. So it was already getting quite high. But then look what happened next, OK? Then came the mini-budget, and that went up to the highest level that we've seen since the early 1990s, late 1980s, up to about 27% of your income. And that's the real concern. It's the fact that we're looking at the burden. Remember, we had similar charts to this when we were looking at energy prices, just how much they were digging into your average income. It's the same thing with mortgages, Jayne, and I think that's the issue. You know, we've already been talking about a cost of living crisis for quite some time. But now there's this mortgage element on top of the energy bit, on top of the fact that inflation's really high and that people are quite squeezed at the moment.
So if you look, you were paying, say, for a new mortgage, 15% of your household income 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Now you're paying 30%.
Yeah, I think it's up from about...
exactly.
It's an enormous increase, up from about 16% to 27%. That's a big chunk.
That's a big chunk. Ian, let's bring in Ian King now, our city presenter and editor. Both, if the mortgage burden goes up, both of the times it's gone up really high in the past is just before a financial crash. Should we be worried?
Well, I don't think there's any... As I said to you when we had this programme last week, I find it inconceivable that you're not going to get a fall in house prices in this country, given the extent to which the mortgage burden is going to rise. Don't forget that between now and the end of next year, getting on for 1.8 million households are going to come off fixed-rate mortgage deals. They've either got to find a new one, which, as Mark was explaining, is going to be quite difficult because there are fewer projects on the market. And, of course, they're going to be paying a lot more. Their interest rate, the burden of servicing that mortgage is going to go up pretty substantially. So under those circumstances, I find it inconceivable that house prices aren't going to fall. And if you look around the world, that's actually been the evidence already. If you take, for example, New Zealand, where the central bank there has been raising rates pretty aggressively at a faster pace. They've come from a lower base even than we did in the UK, where only 10 months ago we were at 0.1% for bank rate. The New Zealand central bank has raised a lot more aggressively than the Bank of England. And you've seen house prices in New Zealand falling for about the last 8 or 9 months. Australia too, similar kind of situation going on there. That was partly because there was a bubble in those markets. But it's inconceivable, I think, that there won't be some sort of crack in the housing market. I mean, you can overdo the doom and gloom and say, well, potentially this is going to be a crash. And, that word like crash, you've got to define what a crash actually means in terms of percentage falls.
Some would say it's a correction.
Yeah, you could say that.
Yeah.
I mean, going up so fast recently.
Yeah.
There's a bit of it, but it's
Still, we haven't really had a moment like that for a while.
No. I mean, in the late 1980s, of course, there was a very, very specific factor because basically the Chancellor in 1988, Nigel Lawson, we used to have this thing called MIRAS, mortgage interest rate relief at source. So you got tax relief on a percentage of your mortgage payments. Gordon Brown did away with it in 1997. But in 1988, there was a special kink in it that Nigel Lawson said he was going to change, which basically enabled two people in a couple to claim MIRAS. There was joint relief. Lawson said he was going to do away with that. But instead of doing it overnight, which is what a lot of budget policy measures do, he said, we're going to do this in a few months' time. So, of course, that gave the housing boom in the late 80s one more big spurt upwards. And that was why the correction afterwards was a crash.
Let's bring in Sam Coates, our Deputy Political Editor. And you've been up there at two-party conferences over the last couple of weeks. In terms of how hard it is for people getting mortgages now, is there a plan from the government to help?
Not really. I mean, I've just come back from Birmingham, where we've had 5 days of the Conservative Party conference. And what's really striking, talking to members of the Cabinet about exactly this, is just how unprepared they were for this conversation about mortgages. And on one level, you can kind of understand it. So today is the 1-month anniversary of Liz Truss becoming Prime Minister. And my God, what a month it's been. And she came in to office facing a cost of living crisis. But that cost of living crisis was all about energy and energy prices. And what she determined was that she felt that the consumer could not face an additional £1,000 a year on their bills, on top of the already higher level of energy costs that they were facing, so that there is now a £160 billion plan to deal with that. But after about 3 weeks of her government, it's quite clear that there's another cost of living tsunami on the way in the form of these higher mortgage costs that's going to result not in £1,000 a year, but hundreds and hundreds of pounds a month. Now, if the government determined that £1,000 a year was too much in one area, the natural assumption of many, I think, was that there might be some help coming down the track when you're dealing with costs even higher than that. But there isn't. And in some way, I got a lot of different contradictory thoughts when it comes to the mortgage market. Some cabinet ministers want to actually blame the Bank of England for not putting up rates earlier and now having to put up rates more. But the problem with that is that when the city sees them do that, they think that makes the entire financial system more risky, and actually prices start going up. So you're in a sort of doom spiral. So actually the Prime Minister and the Chancellor now feel that they can't do that. They can't blame the Bank of England, even though, as they look to sort of shield themselves politically on this issue, they would really, really like to, I think. But you saw that from Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng's speech that they can't. But more important, the question is, what can they do? And the answer is there isn't really very much money. One of the big problems, one of the big reasons that we're talking about all of this is that in her first few weeks in government, this small state Conservative has borrowed an astronomical amount in order to fund that energy price scheme. And the market is worried about that level of borrowing, so it stands to reason that you can't borrow a lot more. Of course, there are other things around the margin that you could do, but there is no plan to give direct financial help to people. There just isn't the scope to do that. And so right now in the Treasury, they're doing, as Mark was describing, sort of looking at everything they possibly can to help. But the bottom line is that there aren't many options available and there just isn't much money left. And they don't know what to do.
That's quite a gloomy way to pause the first section of this, but pause it we are going to. You're watching a Sky News Cost of Living special programme. Coming up, leading economists warn that the stealth taxes will outweigh any benefits from the Chancellor's mini-budget, as Sam was just touching on. We're going to discuss more of that next.
And now it's coming from both sides, and it's moving this way.
Only about half a mile from the Turkish coast, and it's evident that the boat seriously overcrowded. This is one of the most severe viruses in the world.
I'm Alex Crawford, and I'm Sky's special correspondent based in Istanbul.
The biggest party Tripoli has ever seen.
That's it. It got us then.
There's a lot of action going on, a lot of hits coming in still. We aim to be the best and the most trusted place in news. Clearly not had very much to eat at all, a lot of them extremely thin and very frail. Look at her arms. I can put my entire hand round. This is the cocktail of drugs which the doctors at this hospital have been giving their coronavirus patients. Made for people who want clarity in an uncertain world.
Mother Nature can be vicious, absolutely savage.
The world's largest falls now down to a trickle in places.
I can't imagine how much plastic is lying at the bottom of this huge lake. Whoa!
Close and personal with her owner.
This is what makes the job so fantastic.
Welcome back to this Sky News Cost of Living special programme. Let's consider now whether the government's plans will make us worse or better off. And there is a warning today from some leading economists that freezes to tax and welfare thresholds will outweigh any benefits people get from the Chancellor's mini-budget over time. The respected Institute for Fiscal Studies estimates that £2 are going to be lost for every pound gained through the government's personal tax cuts. Well, let's bring in our economics and data editor, Ed Conway. And Ed, we were just talking about mortgage payments going up, which in some ways balances out any help that households may get about energy bills. Is what the IFS is saying here right, that in the long term we are going to lose more from freezers than we are from what the government is giving us back in any of the giveaways of this mini-budget?
Well, in short, yes, and this is a pretty kind of old and tried and trusted way of the government trying to raise money. If you kind of like remember the Gordon Brown era, people used to talk about this a lot. They called it fiscal drag. And the idea was that, as people get a bit better off and as prices go up, their earnings go up and their spending goes up, but the thresholds at which they start paying tax often don't get increased in line with those things. And that's basically what the IFS is talking about here. We've got very high inflation in the country. You're going to have much higher wage inflation than was previously expected. As a result, you've got more people earning more money. Whether that money is going as far as another question, of course. We talked about, the cost of living crisis and inflation and so on. But for the tax system, from its perspective, you are over a certain threshold, and there are various different thresholds the moment at which you start paying tax, and also there are other thresholds like benefits thresholds. And as you earn more, you start to fall into those higher rate thresholds. And what they've calculated is that more and more people are going to end up paying those higher rates, more and more people are going to get caught in paying more tax. And as a result of that, basically for every £1 that you see your income go up, you've got about £2 of it going down as a result of having to pay extra tax. So there is, it's a paradox here, talking about this tax-cutting government. Well, in practice, when you look at the tax burden, so the total amount of tax we're paying as a percentage of GDP, it's worth noting that despite those changes that Liz Truss has introduced in the mini-budget, or quasi-quatang, that tax burden is still going to get up to the highest level since the 1940s regardless. So, it's partly as a result of these kinds of measures that, to some extent, actually kind of enormously swamp the changes that we've had in taxes. So tax cuts go down in terms of the rates, but the amount that you end up paying goes up because you're kind of pulled into those higher thresholds more quickly because inflation and wage inflation are going up.
Yes, it's the IFS saying that if you're a basic rate taxpayer, you'll probably be paying about an extra £500, and if you're a higher rate taxpayer, you'll probably be paying about an extra £3,000, and both of those sort of cancel.
But the other kind of point that they make is that when you look across the kind of income spectrum, and this is something obviously that we know is the case from all the measures, the tax cuts that we've had, even after the 45p rate abolition has been cancelled, still it is higher earners that benefit more as a result of those changes to income tax and obviously the cancellation of the health and social care levy. But it's a similar thing when it comes to these, the fiscal drag. It also tends to be, as a percentage of your income, it tends to affect those who are kind of lower down in the spectrum when you look at everything all told. So that's just kind of one part of... But the problem really is that we still only have one part of the picture when it comes to the government's fiscal plans. And that's going to be the interesting thing is, we are going to, later on this month, it was supposed to be towards the end of next month, but later on this month, we're going to get more detail from them. And at the moment, it's hard to tell just how generous, how tough it's going to be. Are we going to be able to describe this as austerity? It looks like probably we will, but we don't have the details on that yet. And that, again, feeds into why markets are quite nervous at the moment because they don't know enough.
Let's bring in our city editor, Mark Kleinman, because we're talking about the real squeeze on personal finances, according to the IFS. It's business insolvencies as well, isn't it? They're predicting that they're going to go up. So it's not just, the pound in people's pockets when they get home. Yeah,
I talked to a lot of people in the insolvency world, Jayne, people who handle the administrations and liquidations of companies. And it's actually been a relatively benign period particularly in terms of larger companies going by the wayside over the last year or two, actually. There was a wave of big bankruptcies during the initial phase of the COVID crisis because, obviously, with the high street badly affected by lockdowns and so on. But actually, since then, it's been relatively quiet. That is definitely going to change. The restructuring practitioners, professionals that I speak to are anticipating a deluge of corporate insolvencies in the coming 12 months or so, and there will be some big names, big casualties that we'll see as part of that in the high street. Industrial users of energy, heavy industrial users of energy. At the weekend I reported that British Steel, which is Britain's second biggest steel producer, has gone cap in hand to the government to ask for a bailout approximating to roughly £500 million because it cannot fund its energy costs. Steel prices globally have come down, and so it's struggling to make ends meet. And I think we're going to see a lot of those sorts of examples materialising over the next year or so.
Ian, the government says that this is all about growth. We heard Liz Truss repeating growth at her party conference. Can you have growth without cuts? That someone always has to suffer if someone else is growing, presumably.
Well, that takes you into a very sticky debate about how much public spending is actually productive. And I suspect, and this gets to the nub of it, the government obviously wants to rebase benefits so they rise in line with average earnings rather than inflation. And as even members of the government like Ian Duncan Smith have pointed out, you are going to be taking money out of people's pockets effectively if you do that. So it's really quite difficult. I mean, you get back to things like efficiency gains and more effective procurement. And I mean, this was something that the coalition was looking at 10 years ago. You know, Sir Philip Green was brought in by David Cameron to look at how the NHS was spending its money and could it be buying things more efficiently as a way of saving money. And he did actually come up with a really interesting report that highlighted, for example, the number of fax machines that were still being used in the NHS and sort of obsolete technology. So it's really about running government more efficiently rather than actually trying to make hard and fast cuts. And at the same time, you've got all these calls on the public purse. Defence spending is clearly going to have to go up in the wake of Putin's aggression in Ukraine. The education system has been really, really starved of funding over the last 10 years. There's a problem in the judicial system, which is why the barristers are out on strike right now. There are backlogs in the courts anyway because of COVID. So it's a really, really tough call. And I know a small state politician like Liz Truss or Kwasi Kwarteng will say, well, there's always cuts that can be found. And probably there are. But don't forget, the coalition had a good old go at this a decade ago. There's probably not that much fat to be cut in many cases.
And that's the problem for the government, isn't it? You know, they've made these policies, and as we see, we've got nurses striking today over their pay, and at the same time we've got a government that says let's remove the cap on bankers' bonuses. The optics aren't great on a very simple level, are they, Sam?
It's only 24 hours since Liz Truss basically outlined her vision for government, and there's a lot of promises in that. And the big headline promise is high growth but lower taxes. She mentioned taxes 20 times in her speech, and the core of her argument was if we lower taxes, people will work more, keep more of their money. It's absolutely central to her vision. So I suspect a lot of voters woke up and thought, what on earth is going on here? All the front pages have information about how I've got a higher tax burden coming down the track, and I just heard a speech from the Prime Minister about how she wants to lower taxes. And, of course, one of the political problems that she's got, one of the reasons that the tax burden's going up is because, as well as doing the things in the mini-budget, like reversing the national insurance increase, she has inherited all the decisions that Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak's government made, and that's the reason that the tax burden's going up, because overall, since the start of the Parliament, the cumulative decisions in the last 3.5 years add up to an increase in taxes rather than a lowering. And there is a problem for Liz Truss here. It's quite a lot of stuff she says she doesn't like, but she's still having to do because she inherited it, like a windfall tax. She's against windfall taxes, but it just happens she's having to carry one out and impose one because that she has inherited from the last government. And overall, Ian is completely right. There is a big question about how you make this all add up. Yes, there's going to be a drive for efficiency savings. There are all sorts of Treasury tricks you can deploy. I suspect very soon they're going to raise the age at which you can start claiming the state pension, other almost accounting tricks that you can do like that. But in the end, I'm not sure the markets think that you can deliver big spending cuts because Tory MPs will stop them. And the only thing I am told by some business leaders that they will trust, the only announcements that they will trust that mean the state gets smaller, that borrowing gets under control, is if there are more tax rises. And that is completely politically impossible for Liz Truss.
Wow. You're watching a Sky News Cost of Living special programme. Coming up, oil prices rocket as the UK prepares to set out a plan to keep the lights on this winter. We'll discuss that after the next break. Welcome back to the Sky News Cost of Living special programme. Let's talk about energy prices now. And the price of crude oil hit a 3-week high this morning as the OPEC Plus group of nations agreed its biggest supply cut since 2020. It's contributed to a fall in the pound and comes just hours before the national grid prepares to outline how it plans to deal with a harsh winter and keep the UK's lights on. Well, let's unpick some of that with Ian King. And Ian, just remind us who OPEC are and why are they saying what they're saying today?
So OPEC, the cartel of oil-producing companies dominated by Saudi Arabia, but also including countries like Iran, Iraq, Libya, Venezuela, the United Arab Emirates. And OPEC Plus is those countries plus Russia and allied oil producers. And effectively, they try to control the price of oil. They account altogether for something like 44% of global oil production. And viewers with a very long memory will remember the role that they played in the 1970s oil crisis.
Yeah, and so they want to produce less. How would producing less of something, forcing up the prices, help an energy crisis?
Well, it depends on how you view an energy crisis. I mean, as far as OPEC are concerned, they're very, very worried. The price has fallen. It peaked at just over $125 on the 31st of May. It's since fallen by 33%. It was flirting with $84 a barrel last week. And the Saudis, the key player in OPEC, are not very happy about this. And interestingly, they've been supported in this by Russia. Now, Russia...
So they're not making enough money, fundamentally.
That's what
so they're
think.
saying, we're not making enough money, we're going to stop making it so it costs more.
Exactly. Yeah, they want to restrict supplies. And the Russians are equally in favour of this. Russia can't get its crude onto Western markets anymore because of the embargoes that have been imposed. They're selling it to the Chinese and the Indians primarily, but it's a significant discount, like you're talking 30% off in some cases. So the Russians are keen to see the headline price rise as well. So they will get more money flowing in chiefly to finance the war against Ukraine.
So that is one concern. And, of course, the other concern is you mentioned the war in Ukraine. Lots of countries in Europe are struggling with supplies for energy generally. We're expecting to get an announcement today on the British energy supply over the winter. I mean, is there a concern that the lights could effectively have to be turned off at some point?
At the margin, there is. So National Grid, which is the systems operator, they're the people that ensure that there's supply and demand in the electricity market and the gas markets. They'll be publishing their winter outlook. They have in the past warned of the possibility of a blackout. You talk to most analysts in the sector and they say it's increasingly unlikely. I mean, blackouts are very, very rare in this country, and increasingly where they do happen, it's not due to shortages in generation, it's problems with the transmission system. Most people don't think blackouts are likely this winter. However, if you get an exceptionally cold winter and the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine and renewables output comes down, and then you get a couple of the remaining nuclear power plants going offline because maintenance work is required, then potentially you are in difficulties. But the key point is the UK is in quite a good situation with gas compared with continental Europe. We have our own North Sea supplies. We have underground cables that bring it in from the Netherlands and from Norway. We've got liquefied natural gas terminals, several of those dotted around the country. So it's fairly easy to land and regasify LNG sources in a way that a lot of continental European countries just don't have.
Mark, how is this affecting the retail energy suppliers, the people that you and I pay our bills to and that heat our houses?
Well, what we saw last year, Jane, was dozens of the suppliers to British households going bust. The spike in wholesale gas prices really caught them out. Many of them weren't hedged, as in they hadn't bought insurance against the risk of rising prices. And so we saw roughly 30 of them going bust. Now, the biggest of those was a company called Bulb Energy. Excuse me, had about 1.7 million customers, and that effectively had to be nationalised temporarily by the government because it was so large that it couldn't be resolved using the industry regulator Ofgem's usual scheme for just passing on those customers to other suppliers. Now, Bulb has been in that sort of zombie-like state as a ward of the government for the best part of a year now, and the cost of funding Bulb for the British taxpayer has been several £1 billion, and we'll find out a bit more about the exact cost in the coming months. But a sale of Bulb to a company called Octopus Energy, which is another of the big emerging, fast-growing suppliers. That looks likely to take place in the next few weeks, which will at least get Bulb off the taxpayers' books. Nevertheless, the cost to British taxpayers of having bailed out this company is going to be several £billion. And what I think that indicates is that despite the fact that we've got this enormous energy pricing scheme that was announced by the government several weeks ago, there are still risks if wholesale prices spike again. There are still risks to a number of the other remaining energy suppliers in the UK, and that's going to cause yet more headaches for Jacob Rees-Mogg, the new Business and Energy Secretary.
Yeah, and the last thing consumers want, if they're worried about the cost of their bills, is worrying about whether their supply is going to go bust as well. And Sam, in terms of what the government can do to help people who are worried about this, they've announced these payments, which are already coming off bills. I have to say, I noticed my direct debit had changed, and it was because it's starting to come off this month, isn't it, for the first time, whether you want it or not. But can the government do anything else?
That's right. We've had the £160 billion scheme, possibly the most expensive scheme of my entire lifetime in terms of a government intervention, and that's capped the unit price of household bills. And I think the government are pretty happy with the way that that's landed. Everybody knows about that pretty much, and they talked a lot about it at the Tory conference. But there's another plan on the cards, an extraordinary plan, quite frankly, which people inside Whitehall are looking at. And when I interviewed Liz Truss 2 mornings ago, I asked her about it. And this is a plan that would see the UK government buy a vast amount of Norwegian gas, maybe up to 20 years worth of Norwegian gas. They might do it by duration, they might do it by volume. The government are looking at all sorts of different options. And Liz Truss confirmed to me, on the record, in an interview, we are looking at long-term energy contracts with other companies. The information is out there. And I think the idea for doing this is that Liz Truss is very keen to ensure supply. Now, Ian said that the chances of blackouts are quite low, but Liz Truss hitched her political reputation by swearing that if she was Prime Minister, there wouldn't be. And there's a lot of nervousness that regulators have given some hints that this might be the case, and they are absolutely determined that Liz Truss is not seen to break a promise. And so ministers have been ordered to go away and investigate this scheme. I believe this week the Norwegian oil companies, gas companies, coming back with suggested prices. But there are 2 massive problems with this. The first of all is that if you're going to buy a huge amount of gas now, that's going to be at a price pretty close to what it is at the moment. In other words, hugely above a historic average. And the gamble that the government will be taking is that it's better to ensure the security of supply, because businesses want stability, even if that means a huge premium on the amount that you're going to spend. I mean, that in itself is quite a big call. If you do it for 20 years, that's binding the hands of future governments by doing this, and you are effectively making, for instance, the Norwegian government sort of an actor in British politics, because if, for instance, the Labour Party come out and say, well, we don't like this, then that's quite something as well. But then there's another dimension to this. Those viewers listening to the first half of this programme know that this government doesn't have much money left. It doesn't have much additional borrowing capacity. The markets are very worried. This is all going to have to be borrowed money, hundreds of billions more borrowing with an impact on the deficit. Quite what would be the reaction of the markets to that. So it's an incredibly challenging idea that we're talking about here. There's a huge amount of not just nervousness, downright fear in government about it. Liz Truss, from her interview with me 2 mornings ago, quite clear, we're pressing ahead looking into it. It's not signed yet. They've not really said anything beyond that interview publicly about it. But we could be on the precipice of something with lots and lots and lots of long-term implications.
And let's bring in Ed Conway here. And Ed, in terms of oil prices and energy, I mean, I think we're all able to understand that if oil prices go up, we're going to be paying more for our petrol. It might be that we're going to be paying more for our home energy, but it affects all sorts of other things, doesn't it?
It does. It kind of goes into pretty much every kind of petrochemical product you can think of, and basically about, I don't know what the statistic is, something like kind of 97% of all the products we use or buy or consume have some form of kind of chemical in the basis of it, whether it's plastics or another part of the makeup. So it feeds through to everything. And food as well. I mean, let's not forget that fertiliser is basically a petrochemical product. It's made from natural gas. We use natural gas to get the kind of nitrogen out of the air, the hydrogen from that. So that then, precipitates higher inflation. The thing that is also a concern, and it goes back to what both Sam and Ian were talking about, is that question of supply. And there's two things that I find slightly unsettling going into this winter. The first is that we seem to be pretty much the only country in Europe that isn't talking proactively about how to curtail intensive energy use, OK? So we're going into this winter. It's very possible there'll be a shortage of gas. It's very possible we get even less gas, because there's still some gas flowing from Russia via Ukraine, ironically enough. It's very possible that gets cut off. If that does, we are by far and away not the worst country to be affected by this. You know, Germany, Slovakia, a few other countries, particularly in Central Europe, are really in a tight spot at that point. But they have various plans that their entire industrial base will basically shut down if that is the case, and it will be protected. We don't have that. We have the opposite of that in this country. We have a scheme which basically says to big energy users, we're going to cap your energy costs, much as for households, and nothing about, you know, try to wean yourself off it. There's a bit of an implication, you know, it's only 6 months, so maybe try and do the best. So that is what concerns me, first of all. We haven't really kind of engaged with that, and I don't know quite why. The second is, if you look, actually, I've got another chart. This is a slightly ugly chart, I'm afraid, but let's bring it up and I'll show you just kind of quickly. If you look at the amount of gas that's kind of either come into or gone out of, oh, there it is, on the screen, you can see it there. That's the amount of gas, OK, that either goes in or comes out of the UK. And anything above the line is stuff going out of the UK, OK? So if you look on the right-hand side, you see how it's really high. That's basically, we've got a lot of liquefied natural gas, LNG, coming into the country. We pump it out there into the Netherlands, and it goes towards Germany, and it's been replenishing all of their tanks. But the bit that worries me are those orange bits that are kind of down below. Every single winter, for as long as anyone can remember, we have relied on gas coming across from the continent, from the Netherlands, through those pipes that Ian was talking about, to supplement our supply. We are a big part of a single market in energy, despite the fact that we've left the single market for goods. We massively rely on this every single winter, especially in the event of cold winters. So that's what concerns me. If there is a shortage of gas, what happens to those orange bits? Do we still get the gas coming across from the continent? Yes, we can get more LNG, but if it's really cold, we have a genuine problem, and that is what slightly alarms me. Very few people talking kind of aggressively about this within government.
And it's not just gas, it's electricity as well. Yeah. I mean, for months we have been exporting electricity to France, and the French are depending on that this summer. That their equivalent of National Grid has published something very much like we're going to get from National Grid today. They're counting on UK electricity exports this winter, and yet, according to the government, we're going to be importing energy from France. There's something's got to give there.
And is the concern about supply in terms of there might not be enough to go around, or is the concern that supply will be tight and it will just force the prices up and it'll become incredibly expensive? The two things are kind of intertwined, and obviously the less supply there is, the higher the price goes, and then industrial users, for instance, start to kind of pull back. But the fact that we are kind of at the moment encouraging industrial users to basically use more energy, whereas on the continent, industrial users who this is a big part of our energy use, are being discouraged essentially from using energy. They're being given support schemes which basically say if you kind of switch off or curtail your usage, then we'll be able to support you by supporting your employees. The fact that we don't have that means we are kind of acting against the general thing. We're kind of helping Putin from that perspective rather than going against him, because we are encouraging people to use more gas, which in turn means we're more reliant on Russia. So there is, as Ian says, there's a lot of contradictions and paradoxes here that don't seem to have been resolved. And the fear is, has it just been this summer of so much political activity that's meant that, officials have been trying to work on this, but getting decisions out of the politicians, that's been basically impossible. Well, we're going to be talking more about politics in our final part, actually. You're watching a Sky News Cost of Living special programme. Still to come, the PM has insisted that she just wants to get on with the job after a turbulent start to her premiership. But does she have political and economic credibility? Have they taken their eyes off the ball? We'll talk more after the break.
That has happened within minutes, and now it's coming from both sides, and it's moving this way.
only about half a mile from the Turkish coast, and it's evident that is the boat seriously overcrowded. This is one of the most severe viruses in the world.
I'm Alex Crawford and I'm Sky's special correspondent based in Istanbul.
This is going to be the biggest party Tripoli has ever seen.
That's it got us then. There's a lot of action going on, a lot of hits coming in still. We aim to be the best and the most trusted place in news. Clearly not had very much to eat at all, a lot of them extremely thin and very frail. Look at her arms, I can put my entire hand round. This is the cocktail of drugs which the doctors at this hospital have been giving their coronavirus patients. Made for people who want clarity in an uncertain world.
Mother Nature can be vicious, absolutely savage.
The world's largest falls now down to a trickle in places.
I can't imagine how much plastic is lying at the bottom of this huge lake. Whoa!
Close and personal with her, I know.
This is what makes the job so fantastic.
Welcome back. Liz Truss has arrived in Prague this lunchtime as she prepares to address European leaders about how to tackle the prospect of gas shortages because of the war in Ukraine, amongst other things. The Prime Minister leaves behind a divided cabinet and Conservative Party as the political and economic fallout from her government's mini-budget continues. So does she still have political and economic credibility? She doesn't have that bunch of flowers anymore, that's for sure. Let's bring in Sam Coates, our Deputy Political Editor. Looks a bit like a slightly odd wedding portrait, that, doesn't it, Sam? The Conservatives were seen as a party, they were the safe hands of the economy. Are they seen as that still?
That picture possibly slightly less awkward than lots of moments at Conservative Party conference in Birmingham, I have to say. Liz Truss has three audiences, and having come in halfway through a parliament because the previous Prime Minister was ejected by his own party because he wasn't seen to uphold standards to a sufficient degree, she was always going to come in at a very difficult moment, and it was always going to be bumpy. But there are three audiences, and she's struggling with all three of them. Voters, there are the markets, and then there are her own MPs. And if she fails at any one of those, she's in big trouble. And there's a sort of danger of a doom loop because any one of those being unhappy will feed through to the others. When it comes to the markets, a lot of the problem, many Tory MPs believe, and many Labour MPs are now going on the attack to claim, are self-inflicted. Now, in the early period of Liz Truss's government, there was, behind the scenes, a lot of attack on institutions, the Office for Budget Responsibility, the Bank of England, there was the sacking of the most senior civil servant in the Treasury. All of these things unnerved the markets, and that was in addition to the higher-than-expected spending in that mini-budget. And I think the combination of a willingness of cabinet members to spend big and then to hint that they were going to spend even bigger whenever they went on telly, a sort of fiscal incontinence whenever the likes of Jacob Rees-Mogg turned up in the TV studio. It was that whole package that unnerved the market. So now they have this job to do in the next few weeks. Whenever this statement is, it's not quite clear that it's this month. It's probably this month brought forward, but it's not quite clear, and even that lack of clarity is worrying some. So they've got a job to do reassuring that, and they need to find spending cuts, and they need to find ways of reassuring the market, but all of those are difficult decisions that we're not quite sure about. The second thing is voters have seen the turmoil. They've looked at it and they've given it a thumbs down. There is a 33-point deficit of the Conservative Party behind Labour. Liz Truss has got worse poll ratings than at any point that Boris Johnson enjoyed. And amongst key demographics, including pensions, the gap between Labour and the Tories, always, when Boris Johnson was in power, healthy Tory leads. Now, that's all dwindling. And both of those things are feeding into the opinion of the third group, the most important group in some ways in the short term, which is Tory MPs. Now, the biggest moment in Birmingham came at 7:20 a.m. on social media, and it was the announcement by Kwasi Kwarteng that he was abandoning the top rate of tax abolition, that 45p top rate for people earning £150,000. He was going to abolish it, now they're going to keep it. It's why that happened that really matters. It happened because there was a revolt. Michael Gove has appointed himself the leader of the internal opposition, Grant Shapps, all sorts of Tory MPs coming out and going, we don't like what you've done, stop it. And even though Liz Truss styles herself as proto-Thatcher, lady not for turning, she had to give in to her party. But there are lots of other plans that Tory MPs think are mad. And they think that having put the handcuffs on her once, they may have to put handcuffs on her again. And that could happen again and again and again. So we may end up effectively with the MPs forcing her to have effectively a sort of zombie government. And what's that going to do to the voters? And what's that going to do to the markets?
And let's bring in Ed. Ed, if it does seem that the Prime Minister isn't essentially in charge of her own party, as Sam is suggesting, that doesn't then sort of augur great economic stability, does it?
Well, no, but by the same token, she's, as she's got less in control, actually markets have got a little bit calmer. So this week they are calmer than they were last week. There's a lot going on. Right now, where is it? The pound, you can see it there on your screen. It's down to kind of 113, but it was up at 114 yesterday. It's a little bit weaker, but it is stronger and slightly less volatile than it was last week. Part of the reason for that is that the Bank of England intervened in this extraordinary way last week. And we just got, actually, just this morning, an interesting letter from the Deputy Governor there for Financial Stability, John Cunliffe, kind of giving a little bit more colour on the reasons they took that decision. And you'll remember we had a story running about how certain kind of funds there were within hours of potential default or indeed having to be essentially collapse. And he has essentially confirmed this, saying it was likely that these funds, talking about LDI, the kind of specific types, specific types of funds that the pension funds are invested in, would have to begin the process of winding up in the following morning. What's also interesting from that letter, I want to show you a chart, because there's a chart that he includes in there, and it goes to this point. Do you remember this point that the government was trying to underline, that this was a story of international volatility? But have a look at this, OK? I'm going to get up to just show you the lines here. Again, this is a chart that came from the Bank of England just earlier on this morning. And the key thing to look at here is the higher these are, the higher the yield is, so the higher the interest rate is, and basically, you're having to give people more money for borrowing off them. And what you can see here is the turquoise line is the UK, then you've got the US, the orange one, the euro area is purple. And look how close they all are, up until 14th September, late September, and then came both the MPC decision, but it looks like, more importantly, that fiscal event. Look at how the turquoise line, the UK 30-year gilt yield, just went way up compared with these other lines that basically stayed where they were. Really kind of underlining the fact that in that period, this was very much a UK-specific issue. If there were any doubt about it, it's been kind of drummed in here by this chart from the Bank of England. But then the other critical thing is this. Look, the bank steps in and then the yield comes down an awful lot. Still not where it was before. You've still got a premium there. What's that premium? A premium perhaps of concern about what the government is actually going to do. But that, I think, is the interesting thing, Jane. That moment there was massive for the Bank of England. And that brings me to, I guess, quite an interesting point that goes back to what Sam was talking about. Was this the moment that those institutions, like the Bank of England, like the Treasury, like the OBR, suddenly actually, paradoxically, became more powerful and more influential than they were before Liz Truss actually came along, because they've shown that they can do stuff, they can sort things out. You've got Liz Truss going to the OBR to basically say, we're going to do what you want. So it's a really interesting shift here, and not the one that she would have wanted.
No, slightly, possibly the opposite to what she was hoping to achieve. Very briefly, Mark, how are the markets and how are businesses reacting to this government so far, would you say?
Well, we've talked a bit there about the pound's modest recovery since that historic low of $1.03 a couple of weeks ago. going back to that mini budget of a couple of weeks ago, actually, it's important to note that many of the major business lobbying groups in the UK actually welcomed many of the supply side measures that were announced by the Chancellor that day. And it was only after that that, when markets reacted very negatively to much of what Kwasi Kwarteng said in terms of his unfunded tax cuts, that there was a sort of reappraisal. But, business wants stability, certainty, investment. It's an open question with so many of the Treasury's tax policies seeming to change from one week to the next, how much of that we're actually going to get from this administration.
Yeah, and Ian, we've only got 30 seconds left. Very briefly, pensions, where are we with that? Because that was obviously a big concern last week.
Yeah, I mean, the bank's intervention was decisive. I was talking to a fund manager last night who said the gilt market actually froze. There were no gilts changing hands. At the long end of the maturities, 20 and 30 years, the intervention has unfrozen the gilt market, although it's worth pointing out gilt yields are still higher than they were prior to the bank's intervention and other maturities.
Ian, Mark, Sam and Ed, thank you all very much. That was a Sky News Cost of Living special programme. Thanks very much for watching. All the rest of the day's news coming up at 1 o'clock.